Hello, I'm Daniel Mills, and welcome to the fourth of my podcasts, in which I have a conversation with inspirational people that I've got to know over the years. In the first three, I spoke to four people that I met when I was a student: Ben Hart, Lynette Hart, Kathy Hout, and Ian Dunbar. Tonight's guest is somebody who I didn't actually get to meet on that trip when I was a student. Unfortunately, she was just leaving Pennsylvania at that time, but I got to know since then, and she was certainly somebody who was very prominent in my learning at the time. Vicky Voith is perhaps a name that's perhaps not as well known nowadays as it should be. I don't know, but I know sometimes when I mention it to the students, they sometimes don't immediately click. But if you do something like systematic desensitization, this is one of the people who established that these methods work in cats and dogs. So she should be a household name. So it's a name that you should know. And it's my great pleasure to welcome Vicky this evening, or lunchtime as you are on the West Coast. So welcome, and I say thanks a lot for coming in, especially on a Sunday, to your work in order to get a decent Wi-Fi connection. So as I said, I actually sort of knew your work very much before I knew you, and there were a couple of really standard texts, or well, maybe not standard texts, but absolutely essential texts. There were the series of articles that eventually appeared in the compendium, and I dug out my old copy, which I've got here, and we'll return to it. And I don't know if it's still available, but the reading,
no, out of print.
It's a shame, because it really ought to be available. And the other thing was the 1982 Vet Clinics of North America, which was quite something as a text. And the Vet Clinics series are series of articles that are, you get together the experts in the area to all write different articles. But and with the compendium articles, you co-author a lot of it with Peter Borchelt, who was another pioneer, and we'll perhaps talk a little bit about him later on. But in the Vet Clinics, you're authoring about 9 of the chapters, and I presume that's because there just weren't the other people out there then.
Yeah, we both wrote most of those, and actually helped the other people write there. So yeah, there really were very few people doing this engaged in this work at that time.
Yeah, I mean, as I said, to me, and I said sort of in the introduction, if you use things like desensitization, counter conditioning, it's actually your work that seems to be the sort of amongst the first to document its use. There's some stuff by David Tuber, and again, perhaps later on we'll get to chat about David, somebody I knew personally, but I know that you knew him very well. But you were really the person who kicked off a lot of these sort of fundamental methods. So how did you come into this field in the beginning?
Well, it sort of started at Ohio State University, and I was halfway through veterinary school, and I read a book called Territorial Imperative by Robert Ardrey, and it was a popular book. And I remember reading it and not being so much fascinated about the parallels he was making between people and animals, but the stories about the animals that he was telling, the ethology stories and the field work. And I had no idea that this existed as something people could do, which is actually study the behavior of animals, particularly in the field or their natural behaviors. And I thought it was fascinating. So immediately upon graduating from vet school, I went on to get a master's degree, technically in veterinary medicine, but essentially in ethology with Rothenbuehler at Ohio State. So while I was doing that, teaching as an unpaid research assistant, and rather a graduate student for his class, but it was wonderful. So while I was doing that, he said, there's 2 people you should meet here on campus, Halderstall and Tuber, and they're starting to use treating behavior problems in animals. And I think we might be interested in meeting them. So I did. And they were both psychologists, one an operant person, Halderstall, and Tuber, who was a dyed-in-the-wool classical conditioning student. And they were seeing a couple cases at the Ohio State University Veterinary Clinic. And I joined forces with them for a while. And we started applying these basic psychology principles of learning, either operant or classical conditioning to things. And David Tuber was really the biggest pioneer in this. And it was fascinating, the stuff that we did, and we were able to treat behaviors that were not traditionally addressed by dog trainers. So there was thunderstorm phobias, separation anxiety, apprehension and fear, as opposed to just threatening the animal to try to make them stop doing something. And it worked well. And it was really amazing. So that's how I started with this. And then I joined forces with Hildesthal and Tuber for a couple of years. And we saw cases for a little while at Ohio State University. And then it wasn't too easy seeing them there because we didn't really have a space that was conducive to treating behavior problems and being comfortable, having the clients be comfortable and things. So an apartment was rented near campus, and the entire living room of the apartment was converted into a office and a place where we saw behavior cases. So when people came in, we had coffee and people could sit down and relax, and we could interview them and try to decipher what was going on with the pets. So in an effort to try to get clients so we could get more cases and learn more things, because it was really not very many people were coming to see us. I mean, weeks would go by. So mostly what David Tuber and I did was study. So he was working on his PhD in psych, and by this time, I think I had now started on a master's program in psych at Ohio State. So we spent most of our time studying. And David was an incredible tutor because I had very little background in psychology when I embarked on graduate school in psychology. And I clearly remembered opening the first paper we were supposed to review for an evening class by Rescorla. And I'm reading it and I'm thinking, I don't understand the first word in this paper. So David would take me and we would go over line by line what all these things meant. And it was wonderful. And I really snowed the other graduate students when I got to give my paper. But it was due to a lot of good tutoring. Anyway, people were very skeptical when they did come to see us at our facility there in the apartment. They were worried they were being psychoanalyzed. So it was actually very helpful to be a veterinarian as part of this group, because veterinarians are trusted, and they're not scary. But the people were very nervous when they'd come in with their dog, and they'd say, I know you're psychoanalyzing us, aren't you? You're really psychoanalyzing us, aren't you? And that was what they thought. But of course, as they relaxed and they began to realize we were just focusing on the animal. But people were afraid to come. So this is a little jump forward. So for a while, I started asking people if they had told anybody they were coming to see a behaviorist or a psychologist for an animal behavior problem. And most people said no. And one woman said, well, I told my mother. And I said, well, what did she say? And the woman said, she said, don't tell anyone. So they were that afraid that they were being psychoanalyzed, and it was all their fault. And it wasn't just the behavior of the animal that was the focus of the attention. And these turn out to be species typical behaviors animals exhibit. Owners may not know how to cope with them, but they didn't necessarily because they didn't know how to deal with it, it would possibly get developed, but they didn't make the animal become this way. They just didn't know how to deal with it and recognize with what was happening.
So what was the sort of temperature like then? Because obviously people have had problems with their pets since they've been having pets. I mean, did they just think they had to live with it? Did they just think, well, it's I need a trainer to sort it out? Or, I mean, how did you sort of persuade them that there is actually there's a professional service here?
Well, prior to when we got involved in this, people just referred to dog trainers, and that was the standard of care. And most veterinarians didn't really offer any advice other than to control the dog, send it to dog training school, etc. But while I was trying to drum up some clients for us so we could see more cases, I would go to the veterinary meetings that were occurring in the area, in Ohio, their monthly meetings, etc., and talk to them about what we were doing and things. And they said, oh yeah, I heard about you guys. You're the ones who treat the crazy people. So even the veterinarians thought that if a dog had a behavior problem, it was really the owner. And no, they weren't crazy. They were distraught with their pet, but they weren't crazy. And a lot of times veterinarians didn't believe what the owners were telling them about their pets, but owners are excellent observers of their animals' behaviors. They're not very good interpreters often as to what it means, but most owners that love their animals and live with them are very good observers. And once you start just asking about the behaviors of the animal, they sort of get into the groove. They start talking about the behaviors. And so it took several years before it became somewhat acceptable to refer a dog or a cat to a behaviorist.
Yeah, I mean, even now there are people who are very skeptical about it. One of the things that really strikes me about the early work, and I gave you a very garbled introduction. I should have given you a fuller introduction because, as I said, you are one of the pioneers out there. And as I said, I've already done chats with people like Ian Dunbar, and I know that Ian was heavily influenced by your work. But one of the things that really strikes me when I look at some of the early papers is just how methodical you were. Now, there's an obscure publication by David Tuber, and I think it sort of epitomizes what you're saying. It's in a book called Psychopathology in Animals. And in that chapter, he describes the desensitization of dogs to noise fears, also separation anxiety. And he produces graphs of this is what is happening each section. And actually, I printed one out here, and I will just hold it up to the camera just for the sake of people can see just how methodical he was. And I'll probably do a PDF and shove it onto the talk afterwards. But each of these
that would be great, because that's a great article. I wasn't even familiar with it till you sent it to me. I'm familiar with how Tuber approached things.
But these are different sessions. So this is how, and this is the down here is the lowest volume. These are the volumes as they go up and whatever. And it is just, it's just, we seem to lose that for a long period of time. Now you've got a sort of second advent of people, like Clive Wynne, who I know very well, and Friedman and the like, who are advocating very much, applied behavioral analysis. And I'm thinking, yeah, you're the second wave, and they're starting to publish papers where they're doing similar documentation, and it's strange because I know when I spoke to Clive about this, he wasn't aware of this publication, and he published some stuff on documenting the incremental changes that are widely used in applied behavioral analysis. And I said, well, David Tuber was doing this back in the 70s. And so I sent him a copy of that. And, the stuff you were doing, it's almost as if sort of it's become so mainstream that people have forgotten who did it originally. I just wonder, is it very satisfying to think that, what you've done has become so mainstream, or is it frustrating to think, because you're still in academia, which, people aren't citing your work and the early work. I occasionally get comments from referees saying, can I cite a more recent paper? And I'm thinking, no, this is the original people. And I think you should give credit where the original people were done. I just wonder how you feel like that, because as I said, the series of articles in from the compendium and in the vet clinics of North America really were the first sort of coherent body of this is how it works. This is what you need to do. How do you, it's sort
of frustrating not to be cited, because when you're doing the work and putting all the work into developing these things and experimenting with them and coming up with ideas, you're not really thinking about being cited. You're doing it because it's exciting and it's fun and you're creating something. It's sort of like if you wrote a song. You're not thinking about somebody stealing the song or adapting it to something else. You just did it because it was fun to create it. But then again, it's a little bit like after you wrote a song. If somebody else takes it and never recognizes that you helped develop this or wrote it first, then you sort of think, that's not fair. That's sort of disappointing. So it's sort of like that, because you're creating something and then you're not cited or recognized for having helped create it or create it.
That's the thing. I mean, as I said, it was a bit garbled, my introduction, and I didn't say some of the things that I wanted to. But yeah, I know when I've mentioned your name to students, it's not for some of them. I mention these names because I know you and I know the other people, and I sort of drop names in, not to sort of name drop, but just because I know these people, and these are the people that were doing it, and I think it's important we understand where ideas have come from. And yeah, there doesn't seem to be that level of recognize, and I think that's one of the reasons why I also wanted to do these podcasts, because I'm thinking, well, the pioneers, a lot of them are still around, and I think it's important that people get to hear about their work and some of the challenges that they faced, but also credit should be given where credit is due. I mean, I know the story, and it's in the beginning of the compendium there, about the paper that you wrote on animal clinical psychology, a modest proposal, or clinical animal behavior, a modest proposal. And you tell there the story that you submitted the paper for publication and you never heard anything for a year. And if it wasn't for the professor at Ohio who happened to know the editor of the journal, that paper would have been completely lost. I'll let you tell the story, because I mean, I only know the story from the compendium here, but I think it's a fascinating story.
Well, it was submitted, and we didn't hear anything about it for months and months and months. Maybe a year was a stretch, but it was close. And finally, the head of one of the predominant psychologists at Ohio State in the psych department called the editor and said, "What's happening to this paper that was submitted, blah, blah, blah." And the editor says, "Oh, we never sent it out for review. We thought it was a joke." So then he sent it out for review and it got published. But yeah, it was just set aside. And most of the vast majority, well, probably all of the papers I initially submitted for publication, for the first 5 or 6 papers, they were all rejected. They were all rejected, sometimes twice.
I mean, there is a saying that you need to be rejected to know that you're pitching at the right level. But it was just rejected because people didn't understand what it was that you were doing or the significance of it. I guess there wasn't
some of it. Well, part of it was that, but the anthropomorphism paper was rejected twice, and both times it came back with a few sentences that more or less said, obviously people who take their dogs to obedience school think of their animals differently than people who don't, or people who spoil their dogs think of them differently. That's why there's no major behavior problems with dogs that are spoiled or are not spoiled or go to obedience school who don't. And they just said, it can't be true.
So is this the applied animal behavior science paper on the relationship between behavior problems, spoiling activities, anthropomorphism, and obedience? So just for the benefit of those that don't know the paper, so basically you looked at the relationship and found that there wasn't the relationships that people were expecting.
Well, what I was looking for was, are there any really big behavior problems with dogs and owners, those who strictly adhere to the mantra at the time, which is you go to obedience school and you don't spoil your dog, and people who spoil their dogs and never go to obedience school. And part of this was initiated by the fact that my parents and we always had dogs and we never trained them to do much. And we probably spoiled them and, did things with them, like let them on the couch or sleep in the bed, things that people consider spoiling. there were, I don't know, we were just, it's been so long since I actually really looked at the article, but I had a questionnaire that asked about multiple ways people interacted with their animals. Do you take it on trips? Do you talk to it? Do you feed it from the table? Do you share snacks with it, etc.? And then at the very end of, or did it go to obedience school, and how many classes did you go to, etc.? And at the very end of this questionnaire, which also asked, did you think of it as a pet or a person or a child, etc.? The very back of the very last part of the questionnaire was, does your dog engage in any behaviors you consider a problem? And an equal percentage of people said yes. It didn't matter if they'd gone to obedience school or not, if they were spoiled or not, if you categorize spoiling in different ways. They all had the same problems.
Yeah, I think that's fascinating, and that's, you know, again, it just completely flies in the face of what you're saying at the beginning. Everyone's saying, this is the owner, you know, these are crazy people and their dogs. And this still is very much that. I think a lot of the people we see in the clinic, you know, are worried that, yeah, it's something about them. And certainly, you know, human behavior can engage it, but it's just not that simple. I mean, and the other paper that of yours that I really like in that respect, that sort of really sort of threw up, you know, I think a really important issue is the paper where you looked at people and their identification of breeds of dogs, and then you did the DNA analysis of them. Mm-hmm. And, you know, there's a big issue with what are supposedly dangerous breeds and their identification on phenotype. And your work just sort of basically said, you know, the dogs that don't look anything like a pit bull could well be a pit bull, and those that look quite a lot like a pit bull could have no pit bull in them whatsoever. I mean, I thought that was a fascinating piece of work, and it's quite a recent one, and several people have replicated those sorts of effects as well. I mean, again, Clive Wynne and Lisa Gunter, they've been following up, I think, on some of that work as well. I mean, I just thought it was absolutely fascinating. How did you come about this?
Well, to go way back, when I was in high school, we in the summer times, we were encouraged, I don't know if it was through scouts or what, to become what are called candy stripers, which means you could go and help in medical facilities, and you wore an apron that had red and white stripes. And you were just a teenager, so it wasn't anything real specific what you did, but you got exposed to the medical field. And so when I was applying to be a candy striper, either I wanted to do this or my mother suggested it, because she was always wanted me to be a veterinarian. I said, well, why don't I work at the veterinary hospital as a candy striper at the base? Because this was at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. So there was the medical facility there, and there was the veterinary clinic that the Air Force had for dependents, pets, and for other animals at the facility. And so there were open office hours for vaccinations and physical exams of dependents' pets. So I was very important. I was there behind the desk asking them to sign in and what breed your dog is and all this. And I will never forget actually getting up, sort of leaning over, looking at the dog that was on the floor over the desk and saying to the woman, and what kind of mixed breed is this? And she just went, this is a Welsh Corgi.
It reminds me when I was seeing practice, in mixed practice, one of the vets who did the large animal work did the evening surgery, and this lady came in and he said, oh, looks like your lurcher's got a bad back. And she said, that is not a lurcher, that is a borzoi, and he's supposed to move like that.
Yes. Yeah, so then I started really paying attention to breeds. But I also had German Shepherds and Huskies at different points in my life. And I would go through shelters. I would see any dog that had brown hair and relatively short brown hair was usually called a German Shepherd or a Shepherd mix. And anything with a curled tail was a Siberian Husky. And they didn't look anything like a German Shepherd or Husky. So first I started just taking pictures systematically at shelters and their cage cards to see, and my goal was to then do a study where I'd ask people what the breeds were to see about inter-observer reliability. Well, one thing led to another, and I moved from that location. I was getting all those photographs to a place where I was now getting video cameras available and doing that. And then all of a sudden DNA became available. So scratched everything and started again and got volunteers, solicited clients from the area of Western University here. But most of the dogs came from, like, I think 17 different locations. There were 20 dogs and all over the country. So they weren't just in this location. And then randomly put them in, well, categorized them by weight, and then randomly picked X number of animals from each weight group, and then did video clips of them, and then traveled to 30 different locations and had people fill out a questionnaire when they saw a 1-minute video clip of the dogs, both sides, front, back, and moving. And there was not much agreement as to what the dogs were. The only one that really stood out was the dog that looked like a Dalmatian because it had some spots, and most people did guess it had Dalmatian, although 10% thought it was a purebred, which it clearly wasn't. But there was very little relationship between what the person said was the dog and what the DNA showed. Even if you looked at what the person said was either their first or second guess, and then looked at how many different breeds were found in the DNA, sometimes there still was no correlation. And it was very interesting.
And the sad thing is, you know, once somebody gets into their head that a dog is of a particular breed, they immediately make all sorts of assumptions about,
Absolutely.
you know, its behavior and all sorts. I have an exercise that I do with the students actually where I take some of the description of the sort of breed typical behavior from the breed standard of different breeds. And I just say, I read them out to the students and say, right, tell me what breed of dog this is. And, you know, I give them whatever it is. And, you know, somebody might say that's a Dalmatian. Somebody might say that's a Jack Russell. Somebody say it's a Labrador, and you find it's the Border Collie or something like that. Mm-hmm. And I said, you know, this is it. This is one of the things you've got to be so careful of in this field is what we call confirmation bias, that once you get something into your head and, you know, breed standards on behavior, a little bit like horoscopes. If you believe in them, you'll see the bits that you want to pick out and say, yeah, that's typical of that breed. But if you're given it blind and you have to allocate it to a breed, you just can't do it because it could relate to anything.
Well, one of the interesting things about this study when I was doing it was after they filled out the questionnaires and turned them in, I would show them the DNA results of the dogs they had just identified. And they absolutely didn't believe it.
Who needs science when you've got a strong opinion, eh?
Yes. But then I showed them the pictures Scott and Fuller had in their book that they published on genetics and behavior of the dog, where they showed F1 and F2 generations of mixed breeds, of purebreds crossed. So you would get dogs that were 50% Border Collie and 50% Basenji, but yet they looked like Beagles, Labradors. And when they saw those F1 crosses and F2 crosses, they started beginning to nod their heads saying, well, maybe there's something to this. But they would not believe the DNA analysis. They had to see the pictures of the crosses.
It's interesting. I had a few years ago, I had a PhD student, and she was actually a social worker. And she came to us. I'm not sure how she originally found us, but she came to us and sort of said she was interested in doing, I think she actually wanted to do a talk course, and we just said, why don't you do a research degree? And she ended up doing a PhD with us exactly on this. And because she was a social worker, you know, she encountered a lot of issues relating to discrimination, disadvantaged groups, etc. And you know, we've published a few papers from there. One of the experiments we did is we took a picture of a crossbred from a shelter, and then told people it was called something like a Zikiti or something like that, and said, this is a terrier breed from Puerto Rico. What can you tell us about it? And people would just tell us all sorts of things, once they've seen that picture. And then you give them the same picture and you tell them that it's a pastoral breed of dog. And again, they tell you all about its behaviour. This mongrel, this mutt that's in the shelter. But people just make these sweeping assumptions. And Tracy Clark, who did the work, I mean, she had some really nice stuff. And she introduced me to a thing called the contact hypothesis in humans, which is that people are much more willing to believe stereotypes if they don't have contact with the groups that they're stereotyping. So the more contact you have with, groups, the more you realize that actually, there's good, bad, big and small, or whatever in every population. And so we started to do this actually with Staffordshire Bull Terriers in the rescues here. And we asked groups of people, and the interesting thing that came out of it was people who had very little contact with dogs absolutely believed the stereotypes on the dogs, and on the pit bulls and whatever. But the people who worked in shelters, who had a lot of contact with these dogs, but the dogs that had ended up in shelters also tended to believe the stereotype of the breed. Whereas the vets who'd seen Staffordshire Bull Terriers across the spectrum and the nurses really didn't sign up to it. So it wasn't just about amount of exposure. And again, it goes very much with the human work. It's about the context in which you have the exposure as well. You might see loads of these breeds of dog, but if you only see them in one context, then, you will develop that stereotype. Now, actually, a story, actually, I nearly failed my finals in public health. Because in public health, not to me the most inspiring of subjects, important subject, but the external was this person, and I was never very good at exams, and particularly vivas, because the things I find interesting are often things I know very little about, which is why I'm interested in them. And I remember in my first year, the dean took me to one side and said, "You've got to do something about your viva technique, because you're just not going to make it if you don't. You've got to stop talking about the things." And he said, try to steer the viva towards topics you know something about. And in public health,
steer the viva? What?
Viva oral exam. We have oral exams for the finals for the vet school. You have the written exams and then you have the oral exams. So we have vivas. And that's the Viva Voce it stands for. And it was around about this time there was, this is just before the dangerous dogs legislation came in, and he asked something about sort of, well, what breed of dog would I recommend for a childminder? And I was thinking, great, something I know something about. We could talk about behavior. And I said, a well-socialized Rottweiler, deliberately trying to be a bit slightly provocative. And, the Rottweilers had been reported as attacking a number of kids at this point. And he said, to my amazement, he said nothing. And the rest of the viva went on. They asked me about notifiable diseases in fish and God knows what. And then just as I was leaving, it was finished, and I was walking out the door, and he turned to me and he said, "I think that was very irresponsible what you said about childminders." And I looked at the internal examiner and I said, "Excuse me, but this is an oral exam. If you don't agree with something that I say, I think I should have the right to defend myself." So I was thinking, well, you allocated 20 minutes, and my hand was literally on the door, and one of my friends, Karen Davis, was Karen Nicholas, was waiting to come in, and I just sort of, and the internal said, "Yeah, you should have the right." So I said, "Look, let me explain." And I said, "There's a difference." He said, "I used to work in the RAF and I never met a good Rottweiler that I'd trust with kids." And I said, "There's a difference between a trained dog and a socialized dog." And we basically had this stand-up row for about 10 minutes. So poor Karen well, lucky Karen, she only got about a 10-minute viva as a result. But, to the university's credit, I passed. But it was just that issue that, people had got this idea in their head, and yeah, a little knowledge can be a dangerous thing. But yeah, is it this sort of people's willingness to stereotype. And yeah, on average, a breed might be here and another breed might be here in a trait, but the variability in it is so enormous. And this is the thing which I think, that we really need to get across. And, and again, yeah, dealing with problem behavior, people say, well, I've always had this breed of dog and I've always treated them the same. Why is this one different? I said, because each dog is an individual, and that's the key thing. But anyway, so, I mean, as I said, you've also done, a lot of the pioneering work on that side of the human side of sort of behavior, and sort of fought against some of the simplifications, the gross simplifications that are there, with blaming the owner and things like that. For example, the separation anxiety work, and I've heard you talk in the past about sort of, well, people thought that the dogs were just being spiteful and trying to get them round. I mean, how did when you're pioneering, you've got nothing to reference. So how do you go from an idea that here is a dog which everyone is telling everybody that the problem is due to the owner, or the dog just needs to be punished and whatever? Where do you get that insight from to think, you know what, it's not like that, it's different?
Well, you get the insight of that actually comes from knowing the basic literature, like separation distress studies that have been done, parent offspring studies that have been done in labs with puppies, chicks, monkeys, etc. And you become very familiar with what separation distress is. In many species, with an attachment figure that disappears, and then you try to do what you can to regain contact with it. So the information was there. It was just seeing that it was happening in dogs in a house. So anyway, but convincing people that that's what it was harder. And one of the things I would do at Penn was, when they built the new veterinary hospital at Penn, I had them build a very large room with a one-way mirror window. It wasn't a mirror, I guess. But anyway, in the large room, we could have a client, a dog, and a couple students and a clinician, and still have a large room. But of course, the students rotating through the session were like double the number of students or triple. So they would be behind the mirror watching and listening. So what I would do with somebody when they came in with a separation distress dog, when they would explain its behaviors when they left it alone, would say, let's just see what happens if we leave him alone in here. And let's go around and watch him through the window. So we did, and owners would go around and watch the dog through the window, and they would see the dog starting to pace, whine, cry, yowl, and dig at the door, and they immediately would recognize that this dog is distressed. And so that was a big help in explaining to people as to what was going on.
So again, one of the things, because I sort of picked up, let's say, my copy of that compendium and read the introduction. And one of the things you note, you actually say, David Tuber should be recognized as the father of the field. And as I said, I never obviously met him, but a couple of things that strike me that you mention is that he's, most of his work didn't end up published, which obviously is a tragedy. But you said he was working on both sort of changes in learning in old dogs, and you mentioned even then about the work on Alzheimer's, and of course there's been a massive amount of work done on sort of using dogs as models of Alzheimer's, Gary Landsberg and Bill Milgram, etc., which obviously flowed from that. But you also mentioned that he was working on attachment, and it just got me thinking, obviously the group in Hungary, Adam Miklozi's group, published the original work on using a modified Ainsworth test. And coincidentally, I know a number of labs around about that time were playing about with this. They happened to publish it first. And I just wondered, do you know if maybe it was yourself and David, whether he tried adapting the Ainsworth test? Because certainly some of the stuff that's talked about there looks like you were thinking along those lines.
Well, describe what the Ainsworth test is.
So the Ainsworth test, where the sort of the
Approaching
test.
a passive person or an active
So
person.
no, it's sort of, you basically look at the behavior of, it's originally developed for infants, and you look at the behavior of the infant in the presence of the mother and a stranger. The mother leaves, the stranger, the child gets distressed because the stranger doesn't act as a buffer in the same way that the mother can. But if the mother comes back, there's a lot of there's quite an exuberant greeting. Then if the stranger goes, actually the child remains quite relaxed in that situation. So you've got the and that test has been adapted for dogs, and dogs show very similar, most dogs, not all dogs, show quite similar responses to humans in that situation. And I just wondered whether or not you or David or anybody had played about with variants of that, because certainly, as I said, some of the conditions that that are talked about seem to be hinted at there, and I'm just intrigued because, as you say, a lot of the stuff wasn't published.
Yeah. Yes, although we didn't necessarily always identify it as that, but yeah, David, when in his later years, lived in a warehouse and had his research dogs that were no longer able to be kept at Ohio State in the bottom part of the warehouse in runs. And he would continue to do studies along those lines in a way, which would be separation distress responses. If you leave the dog, the dogs always had a pair. And he published this in a journal somewhere, and I can't recall where it was now. But if he had pairs of dogs in these runs, and then he looked at their distress response if you took a companion dog away in the run. And then he also looked at the dogs, if you put the pair of dogs in a strange room, what were their behaviors? If you took a dog away, what was the difference in these dogs in a strange room? If it was by itself, or if it had its companion dog, or if it had a person with it. And the person reduced the stress of the dog more than a companion dog did that he shared a run with. So dogs are very, very attached to people, and they reduce a lot of anxiety in strange locations. What I did, and I never published a fraction of this stuff, was getting really good histories of dogs' behaviors and their owners' behaviors in a variety of situations. And one of the things that I learned early on with separation distress was that it can be very location specific. Because in Pennsylvania, it's cool much of the year, so people take their dogs with them everywhere, and they leave them in the car when they go in places, etc. And you could have dogs come in for separation distress in the home, which was really very, very high, destroying the windows, the doors, the bomb, But yet that person, and they're doing it 100% of the time, the owners would leave. But that person could take the dog and leave it in the car when they did things. So I would always tell owners, well, this was trying to convince them to do graduated departures. So I'd say, well, how do you think people get their dog used to being in the car? Does any idiot leave them in the car for 8 hours the first time? Or do people just naturally only leave the dog in the car when you mail a letter and come right back in? You don't take a chance on leaving it alone longer than it can tolerate. So trying to explain to owners about how to very gradually acclimate their dog to being alone in specific circumstances, and then reacclimate them to, well, I don't know what the right word is, and letting them learn to be comfortable at home. But that's where now another piece of very basic psychology and learning theories come in, which is you want to make a departure different from home when you're doing desensitization and counter conditioning than previous departures. So you give them a discriminative stimulus, so that if you're going to leave and only going to step out the door and come right back in, Maybe you put a gnome by the door when you leave, or you turn the radio on if you haven't been doing that, and you leave and you come back before the dog gets upset. And it doesn't matter if you talk to the dog before you leave. It doesn't matter if you talk to the dog when you come back. You don't have to ignore the dog in all these circumstances. You just have to be calm and relaxed, and here's your cue. And I get students to sometimes think about, what does your dog ever not get upset when you leave, as opposed to it's always upset when you leave? And they will think about that, and they say, well, when I go mail a letter, or when I go out to get the mail, the dog never destroys anything or barks or cries. And what's the difference between what you do when you go out to get the mail versus when you go to school all day? Well, there's a lot of variables, but one thing is you lock the door. So not locking the door is discriminative stimulus. So you really need, for graduated departures to work well in a case, is you usually have to use a discriminative stimulus that the dog cues on.
So this is the thing that, sort of, as I said, sort of goes back to what I was saying earlier on, which I find sort of fascinating. You've just described a classic program there with that attention to the detail, and somewhere it seems as though a lot of that detail just seemed to get lost, and people. And I've got to be careful, and I always say things and then think about them afterwards. And I don't want to be sort of, but people, I think, a lot of people have become quite sloppy. They're just sort of, oh yeah, well, you do a graduated exposure, you leave it for a short period of time. But those key details, like making sure there is a discriminative stimulus. And I can remember Debbie Horvitz telling me about using mats and deodorants and things like that as the importance of it. But we seem to go through a period where that sort of detail got lost, and it's as if sort of, well, yeah, this is how it works, and yeah, and I've never thought about it before, and I think it's coming back now, and we are paying more attention to those sorts of factors. But people are almost claiming as if they've discovered this. I'm thinking, no, this goes back to the 1970s, and if you read it, it's there. And I just, have you any idea? Do you think? And again, this is a sweeping
Most people don't have much patience, and I think that's clinicians as well as other people. I don't know, but I want to go back to when Tuber and I were seeing cases in the apartment. In the beginning, we didn't always know how we were going to treat a case. The person would come in and they'd have this problem, and of course, nothing had been worked out in detail yet. This was in the very early 70s, maybe late 60s. So we just listened to them. And our interviews would take quite a long time. At that time, we were mostly looking at specifically that behavior and the circumstances around that behavior. Later on, I began doing sort of a verbal ethogram of the owner's day in the life of the dog and the dog's 24 hours. But anyway, back then we were just concentrating mostly on the behavior that the owner was concerned about. And we may not have known exactly what kind of behavior modification program we were going to develop. So we would say, okay, now we want you to go home and do some sit stays. And we would develop these checklists. Sit, you get a reward. Sit for 1 second, you get a reward, blah, blah, blah. Go home, teach the dog sit stays, come back in a week, and we'll have a plan. Nobody was upset. Nobody cared that it might take a week, because this was obviously a big problem they were coming in with. They would go home, they would teach the dog to sit stay, following the little checklist, come back, and two things would happen. Sometimes the dog actually got a little better, regardless, we weren't even addressing the problem. Mm. But the owners were saying, my dog is really smart. And they started paying attention to their dog. And this gave us a week, and literally Tuber and I might take 40 hours to try to figure out exactly what step we would use in this point, and then that point, and then checklist, and then do this, and then do that. And then we pages of checklists we're going to go home and do, and then send them on their way. But we were sort of doing behavioral analysis without knowing what that was called at the time.
exactly. And I think it's interesting because you say that, and that's very much the approach that I tend to take now in the clinic. And I'm a big fan of Jim Prochaska, his model of the trans-theoretical model of change, where he talks about change as a process, not an event. And in order to bring, he's done a lot of work, on people giving up smoking and things like that. And I know that there are other models out there, but as I said, his model was the one that I was introduced quite a long time ago, and I had good fortune to actually meet him many years ago. But he talks about there's a pre-contemplation phase. A pre-contemplation phase sometimes doesn't even realize they've got an issue. Then you've got contemplation, where they realize that there's an issue, and sometimes you get a shift from pre-contemplation to contemplation because of one of the things he calls is dramatic relief. So a near miss or something like that. They thought they'd got lung cancer, and therefore they suddenly think, oh, maybe I ought to do something about smoking. And then you've got the preparation phase. And during preparation, you lay the groundwork in order to bring about the action. And the action is where you start to implement the behavior modification program, and then you have to maintain it. And the sort of reinforcers you need during maintenance are different to the ones that you need during action. And then if all goes well, they exit out of the cycle. And yeah, the thing that strikes me is that most clients, or a lot of clients that come into the clinic, are not ready for action.
No.
They don't have a decent relationship with their pet. Perhaps they're really inconsistent. I mean, they love their pet, don't get me wrong, they absolutely adore their pet, but they can be very inconsistent with their interactions. So the dog cannot work out what the heck he's supposed to do. And with all the work that I've been doing, increasingly I'm sort of convinced dogs work incredibly hard to fit in with people. But in order to do that, the person has got to be predictable. And if we're unpredictable, then that's when the dogs get really stressed out. And it's not a bad tactic. And as you say, sort of in the early days, if you're not sure, just sort of give them something to do. But I think it's so important. And it's not just about buying yourself a week to work out what's the treatment program that I need in this situation. It's actually
and the other thing that was important about the sit stays was obviously that's behavior that's often incompatible with other things, so that helps. And that if you could teach them to sit stay in a relaxed manner, not pulling on the leash, it has to be pleasant. You don't get excited when you reward them. You just give them, you get them to learn that sit is a relaxing situation. It's a nice situation. And then you can use that for a lot of things related to fears, phobias, anxieties, etc. So it had that feature also.
But it's, as I said, I think it's there's been too much of a sort of rush in to think about how do I bring about the change, what's the training program, actually there's so much. And I just wonder if going back to what I was saying earlier about have we gone through a phase where people have become sloppy? And this is pure speculation. I'd be intrigued to know what your thoughts are of it. Do you think that is because of the rise of medication? Perhaps that, as we started to use more medication in some of the cases, and the drugs are not about trying to suppress the behavior. The drugs should be there to improve the animal's welfare. And again, I noticed in one of the things that I decided to read some of your early stuff, and it's quite interesting because you say medication is useful in the short term for separation anxiety, and clearly your focus there was on the welfare. And I just wonder, and I sort of mentioned this with a couple of the other guests that I've had, that a lot of the particularly I think in North America, there's been a big rise in thinking about behavior problems and medication for it. Now, there, as I said, there is a time and place for medication, but people just think about this condition, this drug, and this drug doesn't work. What drug do I use next? And do you think that might partly explain why people became perhaps less good as applied behavioral people? I don't know.
Maybe, but the thing that the clinician is faced with, particularly the veterinarian, is the owner wants something now. Tell me, and I get it all the time. People stop me in the hallway. what can I do to keep my cat from attacking me?
Yeah.
I mean, you can't,
And it's
there's
been
not
going
a
on for 3 years, but I want it
answer, but
solved.
they want it now.
Yeah. Even though it's been
And
going on for 3 years, they want a solution that's in
yeah,
3 minutes.
and the
Yeah.
veterinarian's under pressure to give the answer now. And dog trainers will give you the answer now. It's get a collar and a leash and do this. Not all of them. Dog trainers now have moved into being very good educators, many of them, on a lot of things. So dog trainers they're really probably not the best word for them anymore, but no, training still is important in a lot of circumstances. But they've expanded their role into being really good educators, if in many cases. But people want the answer now. And back when there were no good drugs for doing a lot of these things, the only thing the owner could do if they were going to get help, at least when we did it, was to start doing it very, very slowly and then build on it. Everybody expects an immediate response to something.
So, I mean, the other thing which struck me and as I said, particularly in North America, last year, I took my 2 boys over to New York. A couple of years ago, we went over to the US and we had a great time touring around. And then they said they wanted to go to New York for a week or whatever. And so we stayed in Manhattan. And I mean, I live in a little village in Lincolnshire at the moment. My wife comes from Denmark, and she comes from a small town. I call it a village. She calls it a town, but it's about 1,000 people, and they lived outside of it. I'm fine with cities, but I had never experienced anything like that. After about a week in New York, I could see why these dogs are completely stressed out. And Emily Levine, the veterinary behaviorist in New Jersey, I mean, she showed me these videos and she was saying, yeah, this is what the dog looks like when they come in. And then this is the dog, after a week of medication. Now I can start the behavior mods. That's why I use the medication. I'm thinking, yeah, if these dogs are in New York, I can see that, we don't see dogs, very often with that sort of profile. And it was quite an eye opener, but I just think, it's the city that never sleeps. And geez, it really doesn't stop. It doesn't let up. And I could feel, it's a great city, don't get me wrong. But you could just feel, your metabolic rate going up within a week.
Well, I want to say that there are a lot of drugs that are very, very helpful for dogs with behavior problems. And some of them are on them for life. And it may be due to some basic different physiology of the animal with anxiety levels or stress levels or reactivity levels. Even Scott and Fuller mentioned that with their studies on their 5 breeds of dogs, there really was a difference in the degree to which dogs reacted to different stimuli. And the stimuli may be different as to which breeds react to what stimuli, but there was definitely a breed difference. However, there was still so much variation among breeds. Some of them were just fine in those situations. So medication can be very helpful. But I was thinking back to 50, 70 years ago when people had dogs, and most people had dogs, had yards, and there was generally someone at home most of the day, or at least part of the day. Dogs had a lot of exercise. My parents never trained a dog to do anything, but our dogs were well behaved. Yeah. The only thing they did was be sure it was housebroken by taking them out frequently. But they were very consistent on how they acted with the animals. And the same with my relatives who were on farms. The farm dogs were all well behaved. I got a real good farm dog story to tell. But people interacted with them in a very predictable manner. And I'm convinced if you just don't punish the dog inappropriately and scare it to death and behave in a consistent manner, the dog will figure out what it's supposed to do, and everybody will be happy. And that's all you need to do for many, many dogs.
Yeah,
I think that's how most dogs made good pets until the environment changed. Everybody goes to work. People didn't spend as much time with them. People lost the ability to, I don't know then what happened on how they interacted with the dogs inappropriately. Maybe that was the advent of a lot of dog training and the mantras at that time, which were scold the dog, scruff the dog, scare the dog, punish the dog, and things just go out of whack after that.
Yeah, and that's the thing, you know, if you're sometimes, you know, all lovey-dovey and then the next minute you're really scary, that really
Yeah.
disturbs development. And that, to me, I think is sort of where we're currently doing some work in that area. And you get, you know, disorganized attachments, anxious attachments, and you know, they then form models for how other relationships. And yeah, it's just about and I just wonder if that's also one of the reasons why there are so many people, and you know, people can make a living with some pretty poor qualifications and pretty poor practice as well, because if at the heart of it they can just encourage a degree of consistency, then they will see progress in a lot of cases. um, and you know, it's like we did some work a while ago, you know, using homeopathy, and some people said, you are mad to take this on, you know, you're going to ruin your reputation. But one of the things we established from that was just how big the placebo effect is. You know,
Oh God,
if
yes,
if,
it's
if you're
wonderful.
yeah, you know, if you can put a few drops into your dog's mouth, then you've got to be fairly consistent, you know. And there was this massive reduction in the most of the behavior signs associated with the noise fear reduced. And you know, and there was a placebo control, and you know, there were improvements in both the homeopathic group but also in the placebo group, and there was no difference between the two, surprise surprise. But the size of the placebo effect was what you know, surprised us. And it wasn't just that it was people's observations, it was almost certainly, you know, that those that were given you know, or were administering it, they started to develop a routine around their animal, and that probably made them feel more secure, and that in itself reduced a lot of the anxiety for the dog, and therefore its reaction to noises came down as well. You said you got a great farm dog story, so I
Oh,
want to hear the story.
yes, this was so neat. Uh, must have been 7 years old or so, and my parents would periodically drop me off at my uncle's farm in Nebraska, I think to get me out of their hair for 2 weeks. But anyway, I'm at the farm, and my uncle, I don't know if I can't say how much education he had, but they homesteaded this place in Nebraska. I can tell you how long ago that was. I doubt if he graduated from high school, but I know he never trained a dog. But they had a dog, a farm dog. And there's a farm that had chickens, dairy cattle, other kinds of cattle, sheep, everything. There's even milking by hand at that time. But he said, go take Butch, the dog, and go out and get the cows in for milking. And I thought, I can't believe Butch is going to do this. So I would go out, and I didn't really see Butch do anything, but the cows would come in. I think they would come in anyway due to time of day. But anyway, so I thought, okay, he thinks the dog knows how to bring the cows in. Then the piglets got loose. So the piglets are running down this road, dirt road in Nebraska, a bunch of piglets. And he says, go take Butch and get the piglets back. So I said, okay, Butch, let's go get the piglets. And I'm walking down the road with Butch, and the piglets are running ahead of us down the road. And I'm thinking, this is not going to work. And that dog, I will never forget, he dropped down into the culvert, went past the piglets out of sight, came up in front of them, and drove them back.
Wow.
Perfect species typical behavior of that sequence of a herding dog of some type, which of course was related to predation and driving something back. But I was just floored.
Yeah, I mean, and that's the thing again, I think, which you know, there is a danger that we try to control dogs too much with the best of intentions. We try to teach them too much and don't let them express themselves.
Absolutely.
And see what there is. And that's, yeah, we're in danger of, yeah, sort of, yeah, molding the dog in our own image rather than seeing what the dog has to offer and seeing what, a wonderful individual it is in its
Yeah,
own
well,
right.
people are made to feel guilty if they don't have complete control over their dog at all times. I mean, and
Yeah.
you didn't take it to obedience school, you've got to take it to obedience school, or you're a bad owner. Well, not necessarily, but
yeah, no, it's true. It reminds me of the story that Kirsty Sexel tells me, when she did her work on puppy classes and what difference they actually made. And, she had the different groups and she saw very little difference between the various groups. And her supervisor said to her, sort of, "Oh, that's disappointing." She said, "What do you mean? That's really interesting." He said, "Well, got no significant effects." He said, "Yes, but everybody's saying that these classes are transforming." And yeah, but reality is a puppy class is 1 hour in the week, perhaps. Actually, if you want to have a well-developed dog, yeah, that hour can be important as long as you implement it in the remaining hours of the week as well, but not think that it's all going to happen in that 1 hour. I think that's the key thing from this is that, again, people think, oh, well, I'll go to you and you'll sort it out in that hour. And no, you've got to put the hours in order to turn this around from that point of view. But one of the things I wanted to also ask you about, because again, I know sort of, people like Ian Dunbar, Roger Mugford in the UK were very much inspired by you. And I just wondered sort of the stories behind that.
Well, I was in Berkeley writing up my dissertation. I went to Berkeley to do some work at a clinic, but also taking the time to write my dissertation. And Ian Dunbar was there in graduate school, and so he stopped by unannounced. And I was very embarrassed because my house was always cluttered, like the back of my office here. And he started talking to me and asking me questions about what I was doing, etc. And I was telling him, and he said, "I think you've got something there." And so then the rest is history with him and his enterprises, etc. And Mugford was also at a meeting where I gave a talk, either in England with the human-animal bond or one that was occurring in the United States. And shortly after that, he also quit his work in industry and started into the companion animal endeavors.
Yeah, because he was working on budgerigars for a while, wasn't he, for the food companies, I seem to recall. But I haven't heard from Roger for a while, actually. I must ask him to do one of these things as well. But it's amazing how these sort of changes occur just on, chance events. If Ian hadn't popped in to see you, would he have gone off in that avenue? And you just think, yeah, and that's the thing with me. I've been chatting to lots of pioneers in the field, people I've got to know over the years, and just chance events. As I said, the first 4 people that I did with these podcasts were people I went to visit as a student. Your work was something which was absolutely right up there. In fact, I haven't told you this story. When I was at vet school in our final year, we had a new intern, and it was very unusual. The intern came from the US, a lady called Karen Johnston, and we've remained very good friends ever since. And we were told that this new intern was coming from the US. I'm thinking, whoa, we're getting somebody of quality here. They're coming from the US with their training. And then they said, oh, and she comes from Penn. And my eyes lit up. I swear, I don't think, she had arrived on campus. And for some reason, myself and a friend of mine, Ian, we were around. And we said, oh, well, we'll meet her when she first arrives. And she'd literally come from the airport, I think. And we were sort of just welcoming her, checking everything was okay. I don't think she'd unpacked her bags. And I said to her, "You've come from Penn, which means you've been taught by Vicky Voith. Do you have her notes?" I'm just sort of, poor Karen was all, Yeah, possibly. But I actually posted on Facebook that I was going to be doing the chat with you, and she posted after it, and she said, "My hero." So you're still Karen's hero as well. Um,
I have to tell you about Penn. They're very well organized, the students there. They would assign somebody for every lecture a professor gave. They would assign someone to transcribe, they'd tape it and transcribe the entire lecture, and they took turns. So your entire lecture, including the jokes, clearing the throat, everything was typed up, mimeographed off, and distributed.
oh wow.
Yeah, very well organized.
That's quite something. That's
But
I'm
something
not
else
sure
you
I'd
just
like that. I mean, they
yeah,
are.
I was quite surprised, but it worked pretty well for the students, and
Yeah, I think I'd
yeah.
have to be very careful what I said in lectures. I tend to be
Well,
fair.
now everything is taped where I am,
Yeah, I
and
mean, we have a lot of videos, and moving forward with the COVID situation, we're developing a lot of mixed learning and whatever. So, just out of interest, the students you're with at the moment, the Western University in California, and this is sort of a bizarre question, and as I said, I'm sorry if it comes across as rude. It's not meant to be. Do they do they know how lucky they are to be? Do they know who you are? Do they know your backstory at all? That you are, one of the.
no, they don't. And actually, the my exposure to the students the first 2 years with behavior has slowly been just getting smaller and smaller due to other constraints regarding delivering the curriculum here. But no, they don't. And I haven't really had the energy to develop and the time allotted to develop behavior as fully as I wanted to here.
Because you've been there quite a while now, haven't you?
Oh, yeah.
So
almost 15 years.
wow. But then
But the curriculum is very different here. They have a course, the veterinary basic science course, which is problem-based learning. They get cases, and initially they were to learn a lot of it on their own with just asking questions and our prompting and sort of guiding them. It's sort of moved over more and more into some lectures now. But it's such a huge course because it's combining physiology, anatomy, 12 different disciplines, and the bulk of which is anatomy they're learning the first 2 years, because they get clinical exposure, but they're not really in clinics per se yet. So they're supposed to be learning more of their clinical experiences their third year, and I'm not involved in that. So I'm in the basic science part, which is comprised of many, many disciplines, and behavior is not a big one in there. So their typical approach is not to study it necessarily too much because it's such a small percentage of the test.
But it's what's going to keep the animals alive when they graduate.
And so that's part of it. So they're just so overwhelmed with all the other disciplines. Behavior is not a big thing right then. But I try to put behavior in the PBL cases and motivate them to study. And for some students, it does really well. And others are just so pressed for time to learn all the big ologies that it's not attended to at this time in their curriculum.
So so in your career, you've trained again, some really important people, starting off with Amy Marder, who I have actually dropped an email to, and she's agreed to do one of these podcasts, and I'm really pleased to catch up with Amy as well. But there's lots of people that went through the Penn system, notable also Karen Overall as well. Have you seen anybody since you've been at Western University who might sort of go anywhere near like these?
Yeah, there's a woman who graduated in 2014, I think, who has finally finished her residencies and internships and is waiting to sit her boards. And she's going to be a real asset to the field.
You're going to give her a name check?
Lena Provost.
Okay, I'll look out for the name. Okay.
She did an internship in a general practice in New Jersey, and then did a behavior internship at Penn, and then went on for a residency in Penn, and recently finished that. But she's
been
just
working
really
with
remarkable.
Carlo then.
And there's been a lot of other people I've been in contact with unofficially, not really being residents, but help try to motivate them in their careers.
So, oh well. But so what attracted you over to California other than the weather? Because you were in academia, then you moved into private practice, and now
Yes.
you've moved back into academia.
In a variety of industries. I've tried doing some things outside, private practice and things outside academia. And I was working at a shelter in New Mexico when a friend of mine contacted me. Now, how did this go? How did I find out about Western? Oh, I know. I was working at a shelter in New Mexico, but I had a friend, a classmate who was practicing in San Diego. So he contacted me to come out and see whether or not we could combine our efforts and to use alternative medicine strategies with horses. He was an acupuncturist and holistic veterinarian plus Western medicine in dogs and cats, but he didn't know anything about horses. But he wanted to apply these techniques to horses. And he said, well, with your background in horses, why don't you come? Maybe we could do a practice and use these techniques on horses. So I went down and visited with him. And while I was here in Southern California, I said, well, this is my chance to go up to Pomona and visit the Arabian Horse Center, which I've been reading about my entire life. And so I went and I visited the Arabian Horse Center in Pomona, and I thought, well, there's a new vet school here, so maybe I'll stop in and see the dean. I've met her at different meetings. So I did. And they had just started their first class. And Dr. Johnston said, well, are you interested in applying for a job here? It's really interesting, and they've got this new approach to teaching veterinary medicine with problem-based learning, etc. And I said, no, not really. And she said, well, why don't you sit in on these classes today? So I sat in on the problem-based learning class, and I sat in on the veterinary issues class, which is addressing different issues in veterinary medicine. I'm supposed to be in public policy, but it addressed everything. And then I went to their grand rounds, which was quite raucous, with the faculty arguing with each other as well. So I went back to Dr. Johnson and I said, okay, give me an application. So that's what happened. I was really intrigued with their new curriculum on problem-based learning, and then going into the third year by rotating through multiple disciplines in the area. It was, I think, the first practice in the United States that did not have a major veterinary teaching hospital, which was the reason there hadn't been any new vet schools in the United States established for about 30 years, because of the expense of a major teaching hospital. So the people who put together the curriculum here at Western said, well, you know what? We've got more specialists in LA, boarded specialists for all the disciplines in veterinary medicine that you've got at any teaching hospital. So why don't we have the students study in these locations once they get the basic sciences done? So the curriculum was developed to spend the first 2 years learning basic sciences, one of which was behavior. And then the third year, they start rotating among practices, not necessarily specialty practices yet, but some might have been. But their third year, and then their fourth year, definitely high-level specialty practices anywhere they wanted to go in the world, as long as we approved it. So the last 2 years were very clinically oriented. They have 8 weeks on campus for things like public health and stuff like that can be delivered in classes. But it was primarily looking at a lot of human models where you send the individuals out to learn in practices after a certain point.
So the Nottingham Vet School in the UK has very much embraced that idea, and they've gone problem based from year one. You don't do the basic sciences are integrated right from day one. And I have a visiting position there as well as at Lincoln. And the neat thing is that I go over, for example, and I give a day of lectures on house soiling related issues, and it is part of the urinary system module. They get taught, the anatomy of it.
Right.
But I go in and I talk about behavioral aspects, and I start by sort of talking to them and say, right, okay, it's not behavior as such, and sort of, if a cat is drinking a lot, it's going to be peeing a lot. If it's peeing a lot and it's using a litter tray, and the owner doesn't increase the cleaning of the litter tray, then the cat may start peeing around the house. You can solve the diabetes, you can make the cat well again, but that doesn't mean that it will go back to using the litter tray. So you've just done a lot of really good work. You've kicked things off. You've saved the animal medically, but now the owner wants it put to sleep because it's still soiling in the house.
Yeah.
This is why you need to know about behavior, and just trying to get it at that level. And I think it's so important for vets. And it's not taught as a separate subject; it's fully integrated.
Absolutely.
With everything else. And I just think it's such an important thing from point of view.
Yeah.
Have we gone out?
Oh, that's the light in my office just went out. Let me move.
Oh, okay.
You have to move now, or it goes out. Light saving costs, I guess.
Okay.
But yeah, we have a whole system, several cases on the urinary system, and one of them in there is actually a primary behavior case on urination, but it's within the urinary tract system. So my goal has been to try to get more of that put in.
Yeah. And yeah, I think it's so important. You mentioned horses. I like talking about horses. So let's talk a bit about horses. What should we talk about in relation to horses? So how, we talked about how difficult it was to get accepted, with people thinking with problem pets, and getting people out of the mindset that it's just crazy owners and whatever. I say my experience with the horse world has been fairly mixed. I think it's fair to say. And we had a master's student a few years ago, and she looked at willingness to pay, Justine Harding, and she basically developed this questionnaire, and we put it out there, and you were randomly assigned down different routes, so we could look at different people, and we sort of asked them, first of all, sort of which of these qualifications would be good. And I think the second most impressive qualification that would make somebody seek help for a horse behavior problem was a qualification we made up, which was a bit depressing. And then at the end, we asked them how much they'd be willing to pay for a horse behavior consult. And it came out at, it was for a 2-hour consultation plus several weeks follow-up. And I think it came out at less than $50. About £30 UK, and just thinking, this isn't going to work in this way. So what's it like in the States with horse owners and behavior?
Well, initially I tried to do things with horses, and I was looking when I was looking at your charts with the noise and anxiety levels of the dogs with the noise phobias. I did a nice little study with a horse that had a noise phobia, and the graph is a whole bunch like that. I'll send it to you, but it's really neat. The horse that had some bad experiences at a track and had gone over in the starting gate, and after that was just freaking out with noises. And when he was returned to the owner, who then we use him as a pleasure horse, if he came across noises in the vicinity, parties, horse show going on, he would just go bananas. And so we applied the same techniques that we used for thunderstorm phobias in dogs. Tested, got a recording, basketball games, tested it, got a response. The horse was freaking out, whirling around at the end of the line, etc. Then putting it down very low level, feeding him grain. Heart rate went up to 80 in about 1 second. Couldn't even control in more than 3 minutes on a lunge line when we had the noise testing the artificial stimulus to see that it would react to it, because it doesn't help to try to treat it with a stimulus that he's not going to react to anyway. So anyway, after about 4 or 5 sessions, it started going down really fast. In about 8 sessions, he was a little nervous, but you could take him to a horse show and he didn't freak out. And his heart rate was 40 or less when these noises occurred instead of 80 immediately. So the same technique. So I tried to then offer advice to other people with horses, etc., but it was not well received. Part of it is, at least in the States, unless you're a big name horse trainer, they tend not to listen to you, or they did tend not to listen to you. But now there's a whole new group of people in the United States that are using a lot of behavior modification techniques and training techniques that are well accepted. Interestingly enough, they're more accepted by somebody who was a zoo trainer than by somebody who actually would necessarily be a behaviorist.
You mean an academic?
An academic. Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly.
No, I think it's very similar in the UK as well. So, and then I do expert witness work, and I sort of often sort of make it very clear. You know, I know about equine behavior and training horses, and I can watch somebody, but I'm not an equitation expert.
Exactly.
And and that's why I've had more than enough to keep me busy anyway, but that side of things has not taken off, and my PhD is in horse behavior, but I've not developed it in the same way as I have the companion animal side, because there does seem to be this sort of credibility gap that, in order to understand horses, you've got to be able to ride them. Well, actually, if you understand horses, then you might not want to ride them quite as much as you do, I think. When that clip goes out, that's going to cause a lot of upset, I'm sure.
Oh, your book with Sue McDonald is so great. She's phenomenal.
Yeah.
She's really advanced the field of applied animal behavior and ethology so greatly.
Yeah, we're going to be hopefully doing a second edition of that book, actually. And
good.
I've been asked to do the second edition, and we just got to try and get our diaries together to sort it out. But
I'll just tell you, Peter and I were invited to a search and rescue dog meeting in Mexico, at which also were a lot of search and rescue dog trainers who were in the field. And we came as academicians to provide some information, etc. But I'll never forget how this one guru in search and rescue phrased a question, which was, "I'm not going to change how I do this, but what would you do in this situation?"
Yes.
And that was very interesting.
Yes, I've had that sort of encounter as well. I have my own ways of doing things, but you just tell me how you would do it. Yeah. But when I was chatting with Ian Dunbar, I took a clip from the podcast, and we put it up there separately, and unfortunately it got slightly misunderstood, and it's what happens. We were talking about the various ways in which positive reinforcement can be used with horses. And I think, because I call the podcast system, the podcast series, What Makes You Click, people think it's all about clicker training, and it's not. People saying, there's loads of people doing clicker training. That wasn't the point that we were trying to make. The thing is, and we've touched on it earlier here, there is so much in learning theory and applied learning theory beyond just the classical conditioning and bridging associated with clicker training, and the use of reinforcers and their intelligent use in a diverse ways. And I would still maintain that nobody that I'm aware of is really using that full repertoire in the same way that Ian has done with dogs, and popularized particularly in relation to dogs, and lots of other people do with dogs as well. But Ian has packaged it up in a certain way. And I think that it's a real shame, because there's a great opportunity there for someone who who has credibility in the horse field, and I think that there is that that barrier as well, that people seem to think that understanding horses is about riding them, and I really feel that a little bit like the driving test, you should have to be able to train a horse from the ground before you're allowed to get on a horse's back.
Mm-hmm.
That would be my sort of my starting point, that you show me that you can train this horse from the ground and control the horse on the ground before you get on its back, because then you've got some understanding of the sorts of relationships you need to do. And
well, that's happening with some people in the United States, particularly Shauna. Her name just escaped me. I know it very well. We're on the same board committee on something called the Equine Forum, which occurs in Florida. It used to occur every year till the pandemic, where the goal of the people who started this was to get out positive reinforcement techniques and training techniques. And Shauna was in a zoo was not a veterinarian, but was a zoo trainer. She doesn't ride at all. But she goes in and helps people with horses that can't be led, that are difficult in the stall, and a whole bunch of stuff. But she's using the techniques that she developed with zoo animals.
Yeah.
And people accept that.
Yeah,
which is great, because she's phenomenal.
Oh, well, that's good. If you remember her name, let me know, and we'll throw it in at some point. But it is, and certainly the field is changing in horses, absolutely. But I still think there's an enormous amount that we need to know, and people need to share their ideas. And the concern is, and maybe it's particularly with horses, because of the origins of a lot of horse training, I think, associated with the military, that people are used to just sort of instructions and this is the way it's done. And maybe that's part of what's the barrier as well, is that the whole culture is set up along those lines as well. I don't know, but we need to embrace the full variety of the opportunities that, using positive reinforcement, and as you say, trying to reduce the use of aversives as well, because so often that just confuses the poor animals. I think the poor old livery horse that's ridden by 7 different people on different days of the week, God knows how it makes any sense of what is going on from that point of view. So moving on, I'm just conscious of time, actually. We're already chatting for about 90 minutes. Just like to chat to you about somebody else. A name that's come up a couple of times already, Pete Borchelt, because all of your, well, not all of yours, a lot of your early publications were done with Pete Borchelt. I've never met Pete. Now, one of my friends who was in the year above, he came and saw practice with you and Pete Borchelt the year before I went to America and met people. And, again, he authored with you a whole range of papers that were really fundamental, but he seems to have disappeared. And I just wondered what had happened to him.
Well, he's still practicing in New York. Essentially, he's still been in private practice this whole time. I don't think he's had the time available to do much writing lately. We did a lot of collaboration together. It was really fun. He had a background in developmental psychology and was I think the first fellow for the New York Natural History Museum when they had a fellowship. He graduated from, I always get these two mixed up and I should know which is which, Michigan State University or Michigan University. At the same time, several other people that ended up in applied animal behavior were in school. And I actually applied to that school when I finished vet school because I liked the ethology studies that were being done there. And they didn't accept me because they weren't accepting women anymore because they had too much trouble with women in their program. So I didn't go there. Otherwise, I would have been in the same graduate class with Peter. But Peter and Tutora were, I think, both in school at that time and in New York, and they started seeing behavior cases about the time I came to Penn. And so Peter and I struck up a very good relationship and friendship and did a lot of work together, and we complemented each other very well with our different backgrounds. He was so quick-witted. He could turn a phrase so fast. One of my favorite is, it's not seeing is believing, it's you'll believe it when you see it, or something. I have it backwards probably. But you won't see it until you believe it. It's not, I won't believe it till I see it. It's, you won't see it until you believe it.
Yeah, no, is, yeah, very true. Yeah, very true.
And
okay, because
yeah,
I mean,
we did a lot of co-writing together.
Well, yeah, I was going to say you were incredibly prolific in those early days, and that sort of gets me thinking about, again, you know, there was a whole series of articles that were published in the Compendium of Continuing Education for the Veterinary Surgeon, which is a sort of mainstream veterinary publication. But somebody must have had the vision to see that this was important, you know, to accept these articles.
Yeah, we were in the first issue, I think, of the Compendium.
So was it just because it was the first issue they wanted?
Absolutely, they were looking for publications, and the head editor of the company, Veterinary Learning Systems, was at Penn.
So again,
and he knew what I was doing with behavior, so he asked us to write one. And our first one was cat elimination behavior problems, and Dr. Dudley Johnson got a chuckle out of that, because he said he sent it out for review, or at least the title, and the response he got from the veterinarians who were going to review it were, cats are disappearing.
Oh God.
Yes.
Oh gee. It's I'm waiting for some great story of somebody who had the great vision of it. You know, it was a new publication. They wanted to fill some space. Yeah, it's well, it sort of mirrors the modest proposal thing, and it's real. Oh dear. And the other thing which you know, I wasn't aware of until recently, was that you did a whole series of handouts for pet food companies. And you know, when we had a pre-chat about what we might talk about, you kindly sent through, and I just read this letter from the food company, and they estimate that in the 7 years they've been distributing the leaflets, 15 million, you know, it went out to 15 million pet owners. And I'm just thinking, yeah, that's a pretty big impact.
Actually, they kept printing them, and it actually went up to either 65 million or 85 million. But I didn't have a letter on that.
Wow. I mean,
but,
you know,
yeah,
we've got...
that was sort of the advent of educating people. And it all was with Veterinary Learning Systems, the publishing company who did the Compendium articles, Compendium Journal. So they asked us to write things for the Vet Tech Journal, a Vet Tech Journal they also did, I think so. But anyway, did some there, but they asked for parallel things with these pamphlets. So that's what we did.
That's just phenomenal. Because yeah.
So it all hit all at once on the veterinary level and the pet owner level with the pamphlets.
I mean, I've been chatting with some of the other guests about, you know, open access publication. It's great because the public can access it, and you know, I'm really pleased that, you know, we wrote some stuff on the relationship between noise fears and dogs with chronic musculoskeletal pain, and how the signs look slightly different. And that's had about, I think it's about 50,000 downloads or 50,000 views. I'm thinking, brilliant. You know, you're talking 65 million, or I mean, that's just phenomenal. And it's, yeah, you know,
well, people were hungry for that because the things weren't working. I also just recalled another story of the beginnings of seeing behavior cases. It was at Penn, and I used to keep track of every telephone call that came in and log them, so I'd get some idea of what the different types of problems were. But I got a call from a woman who was crying. And she said that she had just put her cat down and she was really depressed. And her psychiatrist had been eliminating all over the place. And she was advised to put it down and have it euthanized. And she said, that's all, there wasn't anything that could have been done, was there? And I forget how I phrased, well, you did the best you could. Her veterinarian, I guess, had said, well, some cats are just like that. So this was before people were realizing you could actually analyze and treat these things. Mm. Oh, this was another great contribution of Peter's, was the cat elimination behavior work. His PhD was on dust bathing in quail. And he changed many variables to see what accelerated dust bathing in quail babies, chicks. And one of the biggest things that facilitated dust bathing was the texture of the litter. Yes. So we started saying, okay, let's experiment with different litters. And there were no other litters other than the big, chunky, oil-absorbing clay, which actually was the first litters for cats, was from garages that had clay to absorb oil. And people discovered their cats would use it. And then the first commercial litters were actually that product. So we started putting out fine substrates like sand, the finest sand you could get, cats liked, and then experimented with that. So again, goes back to knowing something about basic animal behavior and variables that affect things.
So that explains something which I think I've got here, that the vet clinics, because it's funny, not so long ago, I was looking into the stuff on, the different litters, and it was described, I don't know whether it's described here, elimination behavior problems, where's it gone, in cats, and it describes, the preferences for the different litters, and I couldn't find the publication anywhere else.
It's in a 1982 compendium article, I think.
Yeah.
It preceded 1981.
And it just
was a different version.
But it sort of listed, and I had to do a bit of investigation to work out what these products were, because some of them were no longer on the market, and work out the different preferences. No, it's not in here. It's in one of his other articles. And I was thinking, and then somebody else was asking me about it. And I said, well, actually, there are some studies that looked at the different preferences, and this is what they found. But it's, maybe it's from the compendium article that I got it. But again, this is what I mean. A lot of this stuff some of this stuff has got lost. Like some of as I said, the attention to detail, and it's just it's a real shame. And we did a study, and again, I was talking to Ian about this in Dunbar, and to saying, with training, we just want people to be measuring what they're doing and quantifying. You said about the horses that you do that, because there's a wealth of information there. And if people could just get into the habit of capturing that, there's so much that we can still do. So I had an undergraduate student years ago, and we just looked at litter depth preference. They say that it should be this deep, whatever. And we're thinking, well, most people probably use it this deep, if that. And so we decided that we just ran a little study, and sure enough, the cats do prefer it a lot deeper. So it's not just that the companies are saying put it nice and deep to make more money, but just those little things, but they're so fundamental as well. From that still isn't covered, which I guess sort of brings me to my next question. If you're still happy to carry on talking, or we've been going for. So what do you think are the big horizons at the moment? What are the big issues that haven't been addressed, or you think we really need to make advances in the field?
I have to think about that.
Right, let me phrase it slightly differently as well then. Okay, either that, or what do you think are the most exciting areas that?
Well, I think that dogs are becoming much more difficult to have as pets due to the environment and people's working schedules, since they're such social animals, that we should be expanding into looking more at not just cats, but the other pocket pets. Rabbits now evidently are the third most popular pet in the United States.
Yeah.
Behind dogs and cats. Maybe more, I know some people have sort of specialized in birds, but we really should be, God, there's more species of birds than there are mammals. So, I mean, you gotta,
yeah,
they're all different. So you need to really expand the working with these other species and learning more about them and figuring out how to apply techniques that are helpful to the owner and the pet. So I see that as a big area.
Yeah, yeah. Certainly, rabbits are a big issue, and it's not uncommon now for, when I was in general practice before I moved into academia, you had a dog consult, a cat consult, and a small furry consult, as a pricing structure. But now it's dog, cat, rabbit, and then maybe small furries,
and even looking at industry. And how to better manage animal welfare situations.
Yeah.
Not just from the species typical, but how do you apply learning principles to management of cattle, kiwis or whatever you're raising, emus or whatever. There was a student of Dr. Tynes, I think, Valerie Tynes' student. They had to weigh, I think it were emus, at different points of their development. And it was always very hard to get them on the scale, to weigh them and all the stress and moving them through. And the student developed a really nice way of getting them to walk up there for treats and getting weighed and then leaving. I mean, applying principles of learning to management.
Yeah. Yeah, as I said, and it just makes life so much easier. A little bit of forethought, thinking, what do we want the animal to do in the course of its management, and making sure that you build in those patterns as well. But okay. So, I mean, what is there left to chat about? Lots of things we could talk about. I'm always fascinated with unpublished results, and particularly negative results that perhaps never saw the light of day because journals want it. Are there any things from your back catalogue that you think?
Oh God, I don't have so many negative results as I have volumes of data I systematically collected. And tabulated, and I even have it on huge discs of reel-to-reel discs. The first ones are on punch cards, but just volumes of data, particularly from Penn, on different things, and I've just never had time to write them up. I think there should be a journal that allows you to publish negative results. It used to be ages ago, you always published, you had two things ages ago. Articles were always published that replicated another study to demonstrate they were replicable. That doesn't happen anymore.
No, that's
you can't get it published.
There's that's a real issue as well. I mean, there is public replication crisis in psychology in particular, where a number of landmark studies and people just can't replicate it, and that's worrying because
But anyway, journals that allow you to publish articles that have negative results or nothing significant, but they're interesting, and also that let you publish articles data that is really old but still valid because you can't get it published anymore unless it's within the last year or two. Students are even told, don't bother reading anything that's less than 10 years old.
What? Yeah, I mean, I sometimes sort of, when I'm giving a lecture, I'll sort of say, well, this is a fairly recent study from 2002. And then I'm looking at the students and thinking, that's probably the year they were born.
Mhm.
Now I'm thinking, oh no, 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 can't be true.
Mhm.
um, um, but yeah, so it sort of gets us back to where we started. As I said, your early writings were just so. I mean, and it's great that we've had this chat, because I've gone back and reread some of them, and there is a richness there which just isn't in a lot of the continuing education articles now. There is so much more that is there.
Oh, it just occurred to me. The other article that got rejected immediately was the one I submitted on the 900 people who the correlation between visual and DNA identification of dogs.
Yeah.
I submitted that to +1 because I thought it was a really well done study. I got one sentence back. People aren't interested in this.
What?
Yep. That's why I published it in this obscure sociology journal, because I figured they might be interested in it. No, that was it. One sentence.
That's again,
Nobody's interested in this.
That's unbelievable, and particularly something like PLOS, which is open access, and they say that if it's good science, they will publish it. It doesn't matter, But wow, that's because that appeared in, was it the American Journal of Sociological Research or something?
Yeah, I can't remember it.
Yeah,
Something like that.
And again, it's been one of the fascinating things chatting to people, and I hope anyone listening to this who's thinking about an academic career, they can appreciate. Yeah, you're going to get an awful lot of knockbacks. I mean, that said, being in academia is such a wonderful career to have in so many ways. The freedom that you've got, the thrill of when you analyze data, realizing that you're the first person on the planet to know this at a scientific level. I mean, I still find that a real buzz, and getting it out there. But yeah, there is that element that if you are really pioneering, it can be really difficult to make that breakthrough. And I think one of the things that's come through with chatting to all of is that the resilience of all of you. It's amazing that as we say, you're all still working busily, but also, as I said, the generosity of spirit of all of you as well. And the last of the pioneers and that I'm going to be chatting to is Bonnie Beaver as well. And again, you've come in on a Sunday into your work in order to get a decent Wi-Fi so that we can have this conversation, and I'm so grateful. And we're having this chat, and it's just typical of yourself, but also the other people that I've been chatting to. That you'll give up your time. There's for the I don't know why you do it, but yeah. And it's that generosity, and I hope that sort of rubs off on other people, that they see just how lucky we are to have people like yourself to as that point of reference. And as I said, they must reprint that compendium articles, because as I said, they are still absolute classics, and I think it's so important that people read and pay attention to the fine detail that's there as well. But anyway, that's I do say, I mean, all the people I'm chatting to in a way are sort of heroes, but I'm always cautious about what we call the guru effect. You mentioned, and I've said this in almost every podcast, but I'll say it again. People mustn't just be led by somebody with their name and whatever. Everybody has to think critically about what is going on, not just be blindly led, because that's when animals start to suffer, I think. So
the other thing is, this is a bigger issue than behaviorists, but maybe it's not such a big issue in England, but it's the surplus of animals that end up in shelters. Alice de Groot, who actually developed the first dog halter commercially, she was an equine veterinarian, and she had also had Irish Wolfhounds, as did her relatives. And so she made the first dog halter. She called it the Canine Come Along. And she gave a talk at I think it was the first international meeting of the Human Animal Bond in Philadelphia. And I think her talk was on the throwaway society of pets.
Can I ask what year approximately we're talking about?
1980?
Okay.
81, something like that. And that's one that Mugford and R.K. Anderson were at and saw her canine come along.
Okay.
And also help modify it and develop it as for their own products. But the throwaway society, she's been always been one of my heroes, because she's so selfishly treated animals that needed help regardless of pay, and of course died in a trailer and spent the last years of her life in a trailer in the high desert in New Mexico, penniless, which shouldn't happen to anybody. But throwaway society, she was so concerned about people's not treating animals well and getting them and then just disposing of them in the shelters or letting them loose.
Yeah, I mean, treating animals as commodities, and they're not, you know, and if you treat them like that, you don't get the richness of the relationship, you know. And one of the things I say to my students, you know, with an animal, it's social contract. When you take an animal into your life, it's a social contract. Like any social contract, it involves give and take on both parts. And you know, you're in a certain position which could be a position of abuse of power, and you have to be aware of that. But at the same time, you know, there has to be that give and take. You don't have the right to have everything you want. You know, if you have that attitude, you're probably not going to get a very successful marriage either. You know, it's going to be give and take, but you should be willing to do it. And you know, there's a lot of talk at the moment about the language that we use. Should we talk about people as owners or guardians? And you know, I can understand where people are coming from. Obedience, you know, again, I like to think we're making requests of the dog, and when you make a request, you listen to the answer, and it might be that you say, no, I really need you to do this, but you know, it shouldn't just be assumed that because I've said this, you're going to do this, because again, that's very one-sided, and again, perhaps not the basis of.
I remember overhearing my neighbor who was having trouble with her new puppy, and I would hear her say, "Look at me, look at me."
And the dog probably was looking at her, trying to work out what it was that she was saying, what it was that she wanted.
But this is on another branch of things to think about. Is there is a point at which the animal and the person is a very detrimental relationship, and is not apparently going to be resolved easily, if at all. And making the decision not to keep the dog or pet anymore, and sometimes making the decision that for this particular animal, maybe euthanasia is not an unreasonable thing to consider.
Mm-hmm.
I've always, when I started realizing how much suffering people were doing with animals that had behavior problems, and they're some of them very dangerous animals, but that they really have to come to the decision if they're going to be able to do this or not, and make the decision not to keep the animal. I would always ask, have you considered euthanasia? I would not suggest it, but I'd ask if they considered it. And they've been too embarrassed to say they've considered it.
So we have actually on our history form, under what circumstances would you consider the euthanasia of your pet?
Yes.
Excellent. And we don't ask, would you consider, which is under what circumstances would, in order to give them permission to say it's okay.
To talk about it. Yeah.
Let's talk about it and work out what's going on. And
what options are there?
Yeah. And one of my professors when I was a student, John Webster, I remember him saying to me, you know, dead animals don't suffer. How you kill an animal can be a welfare issue. But the decision to kill an animal is an ethical decision, and that's a different situation. It's not a welfare issue, and you just need to keep that. And I know exactly where he was coming from with that. We
have so many no-kill shelters now and legislation for that occasionally I've gone into shelters where there's like 5 relatively large dogs in a run.
Hmm.
And feces, urine, you can't keep it clean fast enough. And they're there for years because it's not allowed to euthanize them.
It's a difficult one.
It's horrible.
In Italy, they have no-kill laws, and so they've now got these packs of free-roaming dogs, and they're causing real problems because of that situation. And it's a difficult one. It's a really difficult one. But we need to end on something a bit more optimistic.
Oh, absolutely.
Tell me some story. You must have some stories you can share. Just
Let's see.
maybe not on air.
Well,
maybe not that can be broadcast.
let's see. I've talked about the early years and
It doesn't have to be the early
the
years.
amount of time we spent. Just what I tell students now too, if they're interested in behavior, is not to feel pressured that you have to give them the answer the first time they come in.
Mm-hmm.
Take a really good history. Have the owner tell you what they do with the dog or cat from the minute they get up till when they go to bed. Get an verbal ethiogram of this animal and interactions. Send them home with a sit-stay program and tell them to come back. They're not going to object.
Yeah, get the owner on your side and tell them you're on a journey together. I mean, I've started to tell my students that we need to stop calling these animals as having problems and making it negative. We need to be explaining to owners, you've got an animal where you can learn a lot, and you can enjoy a lot about this pet as you learn more about it, in order to us to move forward and try and turn that negative into a positive. So, sort of going back to perhaps something I said earlier on, looking to the future, what are your hopes for the future then?
For the field?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think my hopes are to get basic animal behavior in the curriculum of every vet school, not just how you treat things, but actually either have as a basic animal behavior course that's sort of attuned to companion animals or veterinary medicine in my case, but to have a really solid foundation about behavior as it relates to our domestic animals.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, when I graduated from Bristol, we were unusual in so much as that, we were taught behavior, and it's still not routine in all the vet schools in the UK.
Right. Exactly.
But it is so important. And if you ask owners who you're going to turn to when your pet has a problem behavior, most owners will say, I will go for cats and dogs, they will go to their vet.
Interesting. This is how David started getting a lot of cases to deal with, was when he worked with Fran Linden in Ohio. And Fran was working in an association called, I got to write it down, Society for Improvement of Stray Animals. It was in Kettering, Ohio. And this was probably the late 70s. She was working there. She was very much a humanitarian, trying to save animals and help them, stray animals. And she said they kept calling veterinarians for help with behavior of animals and other things. And they said, well, there's this person, David Tuber. I wasn't there anymore. I had moved from Ohio. And anyway, she hooked up with David Tuber on this. And he started working with her for about the next 20 or 30 years, dealing with how to salvage animals that are stray animals and are in shelters and getting them home, rehomed. And she said the first thing he would always try to teach them, as I said, he was a classical conditioning guru. He would try to get people to do with their pets was to get them to relax. And he called this the soft exercise. And you massage it and massage it and massage it until it's totally relaxed. And you restrain it if it's trying to get away and keep massaging it. And you do this repeatedly over time and in one session. And sometimes in a session you may have to give up at some point. But you do this until the animal now is learning to relax to the words soft. And Fran said, this is ridiculous. And finally, after about 2 or 3 weeks of David coming there and trying to get them to do these these relaxation exercises. She said, well, we're paying him to come here. We might as well do what he says. So they did. And she said it worked. And she said, but then when we put the dog back in the cage, it might go bananas again. So David would get in the cage with the animal and massage it. So it would be in that context also. And you pair a word with it, relax or soft or whatever you want to do. And you get the animal to learn to relax to that word in that physiological state. Then you can start using it when it's not too excited in other states. And it works beautifully.
Yeah.
But it takes patience.
Yeah. But I think that's actually a really nice point at which we should perhaps get on with the rest of our days.
Okay.
So yeah, just people need to learn to relax with their pets, and actually, you can put that on cue. So thank you so much. As I said, I appreciate you. I really appreciate you coming in. Yeah, I'm really enjoying doing these. I thought I'd maybe do sort of one a month and maybe do, 3 or 4 of them. Everybody I have asked, I cannot believe it. They respond immediately to my email and say, yeah, that sounds like a good idea. So I don't know. As I said, I'm enjoying them. I hope you've enjoyed.
Oh yes, absolutely. It's been fun. I'm the only behaviorist here, so it's fun to talk to somebody.
Yeah, I think that's also one of the reasons why I kicked this off, because during lockdown with the pandemic, I've missed having academic conversations, not interviews. As I said, these are just chats about things and just chatting to people. And I'm not chatting so much to my colleagues at Lincoln. And I just thought, there's this group of people out there, and it was my youngest son, and he said, well, why don't you do them as podcasts then? I said, well, I don't know anything about that sort of technology. He says, well, I can do the editing or whatever. All you have to do, the people, you have the conversation. I'll take it from here. So, if this turns out wrong, blame Thomas, not me. But it's been lovely to chat to you.
Thank you.
And we'll catch up again sometime, I hope, before too long. I really appreciate, as I said, and also an opportunity for me to say thank you to all of these people who have been so helpful to me in my career. I've been so lucky, and I think that's the other thing is, it is about luck, and just to have met people who are so inspirational and who have been so generous. So thank you very much. And not just for me, I think actually from the whole profession, because I hope people now, look up your work a little bit more and read it and really digest it, because, as I said, there is so much there. And so thanks a lot. And hopefully get to chat to you before too long. Take care.
Okay. Bye-bye.
All the best now. Bye.